I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the break room and saw my mug. My world's okayest manager mug, cracked neatly down the middle, tossed into the trash like a bad secret someone wanted buried. That cup had survived 2 office renovations, 3 finance chiefs, and even the time the microwave caught fire, but apparently it couldn't survive Caroline. Caroline was the new head of human resources, fresh off some LinkedIn makeover campaign where she declared herself a culture architect. Her acrylic nails tapped against every surface like a clock counting down bad news. She always called me Linda, the legacy knowledge holder, like it was some kind of insult instead of the reason the company hadn't imploded already. You don't last 2 decades in operations without learning how to read a room like a poker table. And something about the air had shifted the moment she arrived. It was stale now, like recycled office air with no oxygen left. Caroline strutted in with her realignment strategy, bullet-pointed PowerPoints, and that unblinking stare that made you feel like a sitcom character about to be written out in season 5. She began her crusade with small gestures, removing the candy jar at reception, outlawing desk plants, rewriting the PTO policy in Comic Sans, and calling it playful. But everyone could tell those were only warm-up swings. Her real mission was to prune the payroll of anyone who didn't post motivational GIFs in Slack or gush about hustle culture during town halls. People like me, too steady, too seasoned, and way too expensive. I'd been at that company longer than some of our software licenses. I launched my first project back when the cloud was just weather. I'd outlasted a parade of VPs, each convinced they'd reinvent operations, only to flame out in a year. My job wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Contracts reviewed, vendors paid, fire drills contained before they turned into infernos. Quiet competence doesn't make headlines, but it saves companies. Caroline didn't understand that. She wanted unicorns, young, caffeinated, eager to cry about hustle on TikTok. To her, I was a relic. Useful, but embarrassing. Like a fax machine that worked too well to throw away but too outdated to show clients. Soon, she was canceling my recurring check-ins, rerouting approvals through new hires who couldn't tell an invoice from a shopping list, and scheduling meetings by mistake without me. I didn't push back. Instead, I stopped catching their mistakes. If a group email went out with the wrong numbers, I let it ride. If a project plan missed a key compliance note, I let them dangle. Nothing malicious, just the absence of the safety net they never realized was holding them up. Then one Tuesday, as I quietly fixed a client access mess caused by a junior developer pushing code live without review, I caught Caroline staring at me from the hallway. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. She was checking my name off a list. That's when I understood. This wasn't about my performance. It was about appearances. They wanted leaner, younger, flashier. I'd seen it before. Never thought I'd be the headline. But here's the thing about being invisible. You hear everything. And for years, I'd been listening, saving, archiving. Not for revenge. Not at first. Just because some part of me always knew one day, someone would mistake silence for weakness. That day came on a Thursday morning. At 9:04 a.m., and Caroline sent me a chirpy calendar invite. Touchpoint, 15 minutes. The smiley face was almost cruel. I walked into the HR conference room, windowless, sterile, reeking of laminate and perfume strong enough to sting. On the table sat the cliché. One cardboard box, brown and empty. Beside it, a single sheet of paper face down. Caroline folded her hands like a pastor preparing to deliver a eulogy. "Linda," she began, in that sing-song tone reserved for toddlers and temp workers. "Leadership is making bold moves toward future-facing operations. Unfortunately, your position is no longer aligned with our strategic priorities." Translation: We want you gone. We want cheaper, trendier replacements. She slid the paper across the table with a smirk. Standard template language. Due to restructuring, severance package, hotline for emotional support. I tapped the paper with my finger. Is this final? Her smirk widened. Very. And that was the moment, the one they'd dissect later. I didn't argue, didn't cry. I just nodded once, picked up the box, and left the paper behind. Silence can sound like a war drum in the right hands, and mine was already echoing. I carried that empty cardboard box down the hallway as if it contained something sacred. Heads popped up from cubicles, eyes tracking me like I was a funeral procession. A few people looked ready to speak, then thought better of it. I didn't give anyone the satisfaction of meeting their gaze. 20 years, gone in silence. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls threw back my reflection, composed, unreadable. Caroline thought she'd won, that she'd crossed my name off some spreadsheet labeled Legacy Elimination. But spreadsheets don't account for consequences. They don't calculate what's buried in the archives, waiting for the day someone foolish enough thinks they can erase you without reading the fine print. By the time the elevator doors opened, I already had a plan forming. Not out of spite, out of habit. I'd spent 2 decades writing playbooks for crises. This was just another protocol. Outside, the sun felt artificial, like casino light designed to trick your body into staying awake. I walked across the parking lot to my car, the same spot I'd parked in since George W. Bush was still president. Set the box on the passenger seat, sat down, closed the door, then exhaled. From my purse, I pulled my tablet. There was a folder in my cloud drive labeled simply, "In case of emergency." No emojis, no flair, just receipts, contracts, emails, audit trails. And one very important document dated 2005, my original employment contract. I scrolled until I found the clause I'd practically memorized. Page 19, Section 14B. It was the hill I'd insisted on during negotiations back when the company was still renting shared office space and buying second-hand chairs. The junior lawyer had rolled his eyes. Nobody gets terminated after 15 years without cause. This clause is excessive. Good, I told him. Then it won't cost you anything. It read, in the event of involuntary termination after 15 years of continuous service, all remaining equity shall vest immediately at market value on the date of termination. 15 years. I'd given them 20. And our stock? It had gone from penny gamble to Wall Street darling over the last decade. My unvested shares weren't just numbers anymore. They were millions. I drafted an email to Mark, my attorney for the past 15 years. Subject line, need you to read this carefully. Terminated today. I attached the contract, highlighted the clause, and wrote one line. See page 19. Terminated 9:07 a.m. today. Please advise next steps. No panic, no begging, just protocol. Then I hit send. 7 minutes later, my tablet chimed. Mark's reply began with 3 words that made me smile for the first time all week. Well, well, well. He annotated the contract, added case law, highlighted precedent, and copied the company's general counsel along with the CFO's office. His email was short, sharp, and lethal. As per the attached original contract, still binding and enforceable, Ms. Dalton's involuntary termination at 9:07 a.m. today activates Clause 14B. This requires immediate acceleration of all unvested equity. Current valuation exceeds $10 million. Please advise if the company intends to negotiate. That was it. No theatrics. No raised voices. Just a knife slipped neatly between the ribs. My phone rang before I left the parking lot. Caller ID. Robert Hale, the CFO. A man I'd spoken to maybe 4 times in 20 years. Always distracted. Always half listening. Now his name lit my screen like a flare gun. I let it ring twice before answering. Linda, he said, his voice tight, like someone whisper yelling in a movie theater. "Did you authorize that email from your lawyer?" I rolled my window down halfway, letting in the warm air. "I didn't authorize anything," I said calmly. I forwarded a document. "But this clause, this payout, it wasn't flagged during your offboarding. We didn't budget for this. Not this quarter. Not ever." "That sounds like an internal problem," I replied. Silence, then muffled voices in the background. "Retroactive clause. What year was this signed?" The sound of men in suits, realizing they'd bet the company car on a losing hand. "We need to discuss options," Robert said finally, his voice softer now. "Maybe renegotiate." "I'm sure you're reasonable." I hung up, not out of anger, out of principle. I didn't owe them oxygen. By the time I pulled into my driveway, alerts were already pinging my phone. LinkedIn views spiking, internal Slack channels buzzing with my name, compliance scrambling to confirm if I'd signed anything more recent than 2005. I hadn't, by design. Inside my kitchen, I brewed decaf, because my body doesn't run on adrenaline anymore, and opened my inbox. The thread with Mark was already blooming like a vine, each reply more panicked than the last. Legal trying to dismiss the clause as non-standard. HR insisting it had been superseded. Mark responding with notarized copies and precedent rulings. From my seat at the kitchen table, it played out like a silent movie. Frantic motion, no sound. They'd wanted me gone. Now I was just a line item, a liability, $1 million mistake they couldn't wish away. And I hadn't even raised my voice. By Friday morning, less than 2 days after Caroline had smirked her way through my termination, the cracks in the building began to show. It started with a payment freeze. Accounts payable couldn't process a batch of invoices. At 7:12 a.m., Dana from finance texted me a screenshot with the caption, "Did you archive the back end for these?" Of course I hadn't. The truth was simpler. No one else knew how to reset the compliance tokens embedded in the payment workflow. I'd been patching them manually every quarter since the vendor's API failed in 2019. Without my renewal, the system expired right at midnight, the last day of the fiscal month. By noon, 2 clients flagged our team for missing SLA documentation, the legal paperwork required to prove deliverables. That documentation lived in a shared drive I'd curated for years, labeled with idiot-proof tags. But Caroline, in her brilliance, had cut my access before I could archive it. Half those folders now returned 404 errors, or had been scrambled into the recycle bin by a clueless intern. I didn't lift a finger. I didn't need to. Gravity was doing the work for me. Around 2 p.m., I got another message. This one from Nico, a junior analyst barely old enough to rent a car. Subject line, "Is this real?" The attachment was a compliance report I'd written last year. It flagged dozens of employees misclassified as contractors to avoid providing benefits. The report had been marked reviewed, no action taken, by none other than Caroline. And now Nico, assigned to learn the system through audits, had stumbled straight onto the landmine she buried. That evening, my lawyer Mark called instead of emailing. His voice was steady, almost amused. "You could leak this," he said, referring to the contractor report. "But I recommend patience. Every day that payout sits on the books without resolution, the pressure builds." I stirred my tea and watched the inbox count climb. Former colleagues checking in, some asking if I was okay, others just sending popcorn emojis. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered I existed. They were shocked. They shouldn't have been. That was the point of invisible scaffolding. You only notice it once it's gone. By Saturday morning, Caroline finally broke her silence. She called me directly at 8:30 a.m., her voice pitched in that brittle cheerfulness reserved for corporate apologies. "Hi, Linda. I just wanted to reach out personally, she said, stretching the word personally until it sounded like a rubber band about to snap. We really value everything you've contributed. I'd like to offer a goodwill package. $75,000 plus 3 months of healthcare coverage. And of course, a standard confidentiality agreement to make this clean. Translation: We're desperate. Please settle cheap. I let her monologue for 2 full minutes, nodding silently even though she couldn't see me. Then I opened my email, found the last thread from Mark, and hit forward. The entire chain, contract, legal citations, payout math, landed in her inbox while she was still rehearsing her lines. There was a pause mid-sentence, then a soft, clipped, "Oh, you're going that route." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence was enough. 10 minutes later, Jaime, one of the junior HR reps, sent me a screenshot. No caption, just an image from their internal Slack. Caroline's message posted to the executive channel by mistake. How did we miss this? Legal said her contract was standard. Who approved this? Below it, CFO Robert. This isn't a landmine, it's a crater. General Counsel. Clause is enforceable. No way around it. Her lawyer's a shark. And the kicker, from someone tagged only as exec ops. If this goes public, we're finished. She's not the only one with a clause from that era. I laughed out loud. Short, sharp, startling, even my cat. They weren't afraid of me anymore. They were afraid of precedent. By Monday morning, the board was alerted. My clause wasn't just a problem. It was a contagion. If I had it, others might too. The panic wasn't about the $10 million payout. It was about the possibility of 6 more hidden bombs waiting to go off. Caroline wanted me gone to look modern, efficient, young. Instead, she'd set the building on fire. And all I had to do was sit back, sip my tea, and let the flames climb. By Wednesday, the whispers had climbed all the way to the 17th floor. That's where the board lived. Glass walls, private elevators, and the illusion that they were immune to mistakes made below. They weren't. I wasn't in the room, of course. I didn't need to be. Word traveled faster than policy. Someone I'd barely spoken to in 10 years texted me. They're reviewing your contract in the board meeting. It's ugly. I could picture it anyway. Polished mahogany table, catered breakfast no one touched, PowerPoint slides labeled operational liability exposure. At the top, my name, in bold. According to my source, the general counsel cleared his throat and said evenly, the termination was executed without compliance review. Ms. Dalton's clause should have been flagged. It wasn't. Caroline bypassed the process. A pause. Then the CEO, Michael, who once shook my hand at a holiday party without remembering my department kept his books clean, slammed the table. She had one job, one process. But Caroline treated processes like Pinterest boards. Nice to look at, optional to follow. The GC slid a packet across the table. Time-stamped approval chain. Caroline's digital signature. No compliance routing, no review. Her name sat beside a fat red checkmark. Ready to proceed. Silence followed. The kind you only hear in boardrooms when people realize they've been standing on a trapdoor the whole time. That silence didn't stay inside. It leaked. By Thursday, partners were sniffing around. One of our largest clients sent a concerned email, thinly veiled. We're troubled by recent instability and the sudden departure of key operational staff. Can you assure continuity? Translation: We don't trust you anymore. Investors weren't far behind. A post appeared on a shareholder forum. Is the company hiding severance-related expenses and deferred costs? Another asked point blank if my termination was connected to unaccounted liabilities. What had been an internal headache was now a public crack in the facade. Mark called that night. They're scrambling, the board's furious, CEO's trying to frame it as an isolated HR mistake, but the documents don't lie. Your clause was in plain sight. I let the quiet stretch, listening to the hiss of the kettle on my stove. They'll come back with an offer, he continued. They're already drafting something bigger than before. My guess? Double the payout. No NDA this time. Of course, they thought silence was my price. It wasn't. Silence was my weapon. Meanwhile, Caroline had gone missing. Her once busy Slack channel was dead. No motivational posts, no HR culture updates, just emptiness where her voice used to echo. She wasn't the heroine of her own reorg anymore. She was the villain in a cautionary tale. And I was the proof. Proof that old contracts mattered. Proof that loyalty had value. Proof that someone had thought 20 years ahead while the rest were chasing buzzwords. By Friday, the board convened again. I imagined the slide deck. Worst-case exposure. My contract in red font. A bullet point. Potential cascade if similar clauses exist. And then the line no executive wants to read. Estimated liability, unquantified. In other words, my clause wasn't just a payout, it was precedent. That weekend, texts poured in from former colleagues. Legal is combing old contracts. Compliance flagged 4 more employees with similar terms. People are panicking. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. They finally understood what I'd known all along. Silence can be louder than shouting. By Monday morning, Caroline was finished. She didn't resign so much as vanish. Her name disappeared from the org chart, replaced by a sterile all-staff email. Thank you for your contributions. No farewell party. No fanfare. Just erased, like the mug she'd cracked and thrown away. The irony made me laugh. She'd tried to bury me without a funeral. Now she was the one disappearing without flowers. The call came on a Wednesday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the maples in my backyard, painting everything in that golden hour glow that makes even a chipped coffee mug look cinematic. Mark answered first. I put him on speaker. On the other end, Robert Hale, the CFO. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual bark. We've come to a resolution, he said, like the words tasted sour. I leaned back in my chair, tea steaming beside me. Mark kept his tone smooth. Go on. Robert inhaled audibly. The board has agreed to double the payout. Full accelerated equity, as stipulated. And no NDA. Mark arched an eyebrow at me across the table. That's not typical, he replied. It's strategic, Robert muttered. Cleaner this way. No lawsuit, no optics issue, just closure. I pictured them around that boardroom table. Suits wrinkled, tempers frayed, forced to admit defeat not because I yelled, but because I'd read the fine print better than they had. And Caroline? She was already gone. No fanfare, just erased. A sterile farewell email drafted by someone who'd never met her. Thank you for your service. Mark glanced at me. Do we accept? I didn't hesitate. Yes. The papers arrived within the hour. PDFs stamped, countersigned, final. I opened the file, saw the number on the page, and exhaled. No champagne, no victory dance. Just a quiet, solid ending. But I wasn't finished. As part of the transition, my company inbox had been reactivated for 24 hours. An oversight. Or maybe a gesture of goodwill. Either way, I used it once. Subject. Final note. Recipients. Operations. Finance. Compliance. Legal. Anyone who'd been in the trenches with me over the years. Message. Take care of the place. I won't be watching, but someone will. No flourish. No sermon. Just a warning dressed as a goodbye. I hit send, logged out, and never opened that inbox again. Outside, the leaves rustled sharp underfoot, brittle with early autumn. The air smelled different, lighter somehow. In my pocket, my old badge pressed against my palm. I could have dropped it in the return bin at reception. Instead, I kept walking, past the building, past the lot where new hires still parked crooked, past the little plastic placard with my name on it that no one had bothered to dust in years. By the time I reached the corner, my phone buzzed again. 17 unread messages. Recruiters, headhunters, even 2 investors asking if I'd consult on operational architecture for scale phase organizations. One called me the compliance oracle. I turned the screen over and let the messages pile up. I didn't need to respond, because in the end, I hadn't raised my voice. I had only raised the cost of underestimating me. And they had paid in full. In the weeks that followed, the company scrambled like ants in a flooded hill. I wasn't there, of course, but the stories leaked out anyway. Vendors whispering about delayed payments, clients demanding backup assurances, investors side-eyeing every quarterly report like it hid a ticking bomb. The clause had become legend, Linda's clause. My name turned into shorthand for all the contracts they'd suddenly remembered to read, meetings filled with highlighters and junior lawyers flipping through dusty archives. Every executive wanted to know, do I have one too? Inside the office, Caroline's absence was a ghost story. Her desk cleared overnight, her Slack account deleted, her posters about future-facing culture peeled from the walls. No one mentioned her name, not out loud. But everyone remembered the way she smirked sliding that cardboard box across the table, and how quickly the box was hers instead. I kept my distance. I didn't need to watch the fire burn. I knew gravity would finish what I'd started. Every now and then, an old colleague would send me a message. Ops hasn't recovered. Finance is still patching the holes. People are afraid to approve anything without 5 compliance reviews. And always, the same refrain. They never saw it coming, but I had. That's why the file lived in my cloud drive for 2 decades. That's why I negotiated the clause when everyone thought I was being dramatic. That's why I saved every receipt, every email, every audit note. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew someday someone younger and dumber would think loyalty made me soft. They were wrong. One crisp October morning, I walked past the office for the first time since leaving. New hires huddled outside with lanyards, nervous smiles on their faces. They didn't know me. They didn't need to. I looked at the building, at the tinted glass that reflected the sky like nothing had ever happened inside, and I smiled. Not bitter, not triumphant, just finished. My lawyer Mark called later that week. They're still in damage control. Apparently 3 other contracts had similar clauses. Your case set the precedent. I poured myself coffee, nodded. Told you it wasn't just me. You realize, he said with a chuckle, you're folklore now. Every HR seminar is going to use your case as the slide titled Read the Fine Print. Good. Let them. I didn't want fame. I didn't want interviews. I wanted peace. And $10 million buys a lot of peace. So I built a new rhythm. Morning walks with my dog. Long lunches with friends I'd once brushed off because of work deadlines. Even a pottery class, where my hands finally molded something softer than compliance reports. Yet sometimes, in this quiet, I'd think back to that morning in the HR conference room. The cardboard box, the smirk, the paper slid across the table. Caroline thought she'd ended my story that day. She didn't realize she was writing her own ending and etching my name into theirs forever. Because in every boardroom, in every policy manual, in every whispered story of corporate caution, my clause lived on. Not as revenge, not as destruction, but as proof. Proof that silence can be sharper than shouting. Proof that loyalty is not weakness. Proof that the people you underestimate are the ones holding the walls up, and when those walls crumble, all you can do is pay. In full.